All right, how's it going, everyone? So my name is Aaron Katz, and we're here to talk about PowerShell for security nerds. And I'll wait for a little bit of applause and give you a little bit of information about me before we dive in. I promise to keep this very quick, but I am a reformed red teamer. So I got my start in cybersecurity, doing pen testing, a lot of Active Directory focus and web application focus. And naturally that involved learning quite a bit of PowerShell in order to go after different systems. I am a very proud Slytherin, and I have recently joined as the head of security at an investment firm coming from another large financial company. So I've been in the financial space for quite some time, seeing a lot of fun dealing with security on legacy systems that don't get patched since they were installed 10, 15 years ago, and trying to figure out how do I secure it so I keep my job. So we'll talk a little bit today about what PowerShell is, what are the offensive techniques that attackers use, what are some defensive techniques you can use to try to predict what will happen, to monitor, to even prevent some bad actions, and go through a very quick case study of how APT actors abuse PowerShell and how you would be able to detect the badness when it happens. So first, what is PowerShell? Essentially, it's an automation platform for system administration tasks. At the end of the day, it lets sysadmins run Windows better without having to use a GUI the entire time. It's an object-oriented scripting language, and you could kind of think of it as the command line on steroids for Windows. You can call .NET directly. You have access to Windows resources like the registry, WMI, Winrm, RPC, etc. And one of the best parts about PowerShell is that it's modular. You can build different modules to repeat tasks. You can leverage modules other people created in your scripting, and it makes it just much easier to perform administration rather than trying to navigate Microsoft's Windows and Microsoft's different versions of their UI where they move things around. So there's been several versions of PowerShell that have been released throughout the years, starting in Windows 7 with version 2, going through 5.1 with Windows 10. There are, if you'll notice, 2 versions missing, 6 and 7. Those are slightly different. We're not really going to cover them in this talk, but essentially they use .NET Core instead of normal .NET, and there's slight differences in how they operate, but a lot of the security techniques you'll learn here, you'll be able to apply to those versions as well. The first thing I want to talk about is get you familiar with what a profile is. In PowerShell, you have kind of a profile similar in Linux when you can set profiles per user. You have something like that for PowerShell. And there's multiple different profiles because there's different PowerShell hosts. There's the interactive script editor, the ISE, and there's regular PowerShell. And you could create a profile for all users of the machine or just the current user of the machine. And why is this important? Well, these are loaded in order, and no one checks these. I have yet to see a single EDR tool, a single endpoint agent, really look at people modifying the profiles. And what happens is when you load a profile, it loads all of the commands in that file. It's essentially a script that gets run once you open up the shell. And because of that, you can add a lot of fun malware and establish some persistence, beacon out, establish a tunnel, because almost no one checks these. So it's a really great persistence mechanism. And it's something that if you don't use, or if you don't anticipate your users using, put in some rules that actually monitor this usage. And we'll talk about that a little more later, but it's important to realize that these types of profiles can really mess up your system and provide almost no evidence of anything happening. So let's talk a little bit about who loves PowerShell and why. So obviously attackers love PowerShell. And the first item in this bullet is in-memory execution. That means that they can execute all of their malware without actually dropping anything to disk. So your antivirus that's constantly scanning for signatures on disk is not going to see anything. everything runs in memory. You can also use PowerShell to remotely access different systems. You could interact with tons of different components, RPC, WMI, .NET, COM objects, and you don't even need PowerShell.exe to run PowerShell, which is one of my favorite techniques and something I've used in a lot of pen tests to bypass either endpoint control, signatures, and even application allow listing, because I didn't have to use PowerShell.exe to run PowerShell. And last, no one really logs PowerShell. No one really monitors PowerShell. It's very convoluted to figure out what logs are valuable or even how to enable them. And you have to make sure you're on the right versions to get the right logs. So most companies just haven't really done this. And because of that, attackers know it's very tough to actually catch them, to see what happens, to actually do forensics after the fact. And this is an example of some of the, I'd call it like evil PowerShell that is out there. And these are modular frameworks. And you've probably seen a lot of these throughout the news, throughout your own careers, any investigations you've done. One of my favorites is if you look at the bottom, you'll see Invoke Mimikatz. So for those who aren't familiar, Mimikatz is one of the most popular tools out there that people use to basically dump credentials from a system, to get credentials that are stored in memory and move around your network. So now there's a PowerShell version of that. And it usually doesn't get caught. You have other frameworks here that will actually show you, using PowerShell, what are the different techniques you can use to move throughout the network? What can you actually do on the system itself? And a lot of it, again, just doesn't get caught. So this is a fun example of something I put together recently. I tried this out with at least 4 different EDR solutions, as well as several AV providers, and not one of them alerted on this. Essentially, what this does is very simply, it gets me the list of every user in the local administrators group, and it'll send out an email giving me that information. And it does this by creating a COM object to connect to Outlook. So in this case, I connect to Outlook, I have my COM object ready, I'm waiting to see an email that says innocent subject line, and once I see it, I'm collecting that information and sending it out. All of this runs as the user. There's no privilege elevation, there's really not much going on. And none of those tools detected it. And in fact, a couple of those EDR providers have told me that this is not considered malicious behavior. So if you have a macro, if you have a malicious script that creates a COM object, connects to Outlook, and just sends over someone's entire mailbox, it's not going to get caught. And this is not a lot of lines of code. So COM objects are one area that attackers love, but there's a few other vectors too. Obviously, there's Office macros. You can use scripting, so instead of just using VBA, you are able to use PowerShell. You're able to use HTA files, CHM files, WMI. There's a whole range of attack vectors that you're able to take advantage of and execute PowerShell. If you have low-level script kiddies that are kind of breaking in, or just some kind of mess cyber criminals I've seen in a few investigations, they'll just create a scheduled task which calls PowerShell, which pulls down a script and runs PowerShell again. Easy to look for, but it's just one area of how they'll attack. And I think it's interesting to talk about how those COM objects work. COM was created in the 1990s, and in Windows 7, there were about 8,000 COM objects. Windows 10, there's over 10,000. No tool really monitors these because no one really knows what they are, what gets created. So many systems create different COM objects. So no one really knows what to do with them. And because they operate at such a low level, a lot of those tools just ignore it completely. What I find really interesting is that you can actually create COM scriptlets and pass those to files like run-dll32. So an attacker can use that. They know run-dll32 will never be denied on a system. It's always going to be available. And they'll just pass in a scriptlet that actually just runs PowerShell. And most of your endpoint tools are not going to catch it. So let's talk a little bit about what are the suspicious parameters that you're going to kind of see attackers use more often than not. The first one is window style hidden. and that is pretty self-explanatory. That hides the window, so you don't actually see a pop-up. I remember a lot of times when malware was coming in years ago, you would get that pop-up of the command prompt for a while it runs and does their malicious thing and then disappears. And most users never bothered reporting it. In this case, the window just doesn't show up. No one knows it's running. By adding no profile, we talked about profiles earlier. This actually says don't load any profiles when you launch PowerShell. Because if you tried to put monitoring tools into those profiles so that every user that opened up PowerShell would run certain code and telemetry, well, this bypassed that whole thing. Then we have the execution policy. So the execution policy is not really a security control. The way I view it is it's a way to stop a script from accidentally being run by a legitimate user. And it does not stop any malicious users. There's 4 values for that policy. You can have remote signed, restricted, you can bypass. It's not really something that you want to rely on because you could just pass in a flag and change it. And I'll talk about a few other bypasses for it later. If you see anyone using the file or command switches, if they're not a system administrator, if it's not a logon script that your company uses, odds are probably something you're going to need to look at, or potentially even block from running. The same with encoded command. The way the attackers run a lot of their ransomware campaigns now is they can't fit that huge command in every single script that they want to do in one command. But PowerShell very handily lets you base64 encode your command and pass that along. And next is invoke expression. What that does is you could pass in a script that'll get parsed by PowerShell. And it also lets you use .NET objects. So you'll most commonly see this with an attacker that wants to use .NET to download the next stage. So typical ransomware attack can be you open up the phishing email, you execute that PowerShell script from the attachment. And what that does is it uses invoke expression to download the next stage of the attack. And then last is dash version. You should almost never, ever see this in your environment. The only times people will really use this is to downgrade your PowerShell version, which also means you lose a lot of the security enhancements. And we'll talk about later, PowerShell version 2, which was one of the first versions, does not actually really have any monitoring or logging. So if an attacker does -v2, that suddenly means you're not going to get anything from it. And the interesting thing here is you can't build a signature just based on what these parameters are, because PowerShell will actually use a wildcard. It's fun, it's convenient, but it does make it a little harder when you detect. For example, dash version can be V, VE, VER, VERS, etc. So it's important to just understand what the values can potentially be, or even search for all those possible letters. So let's talk about how an attacker is going to bypass your execution policy. So this is the first command that can be run, pretty basic. It says, all right, I'm not an admin. I don't have permission to change the execution policy for every user. I'm just going to change the scope to the current user. And I'm going to set my execution policy and force it. Odds are that's going to work. But if that doesn't work, because let's say you have a group policy object that's forcing the policy, run this instead. These 3 lines at the end of the day replaces PowerShell's authorization manager within your session. So even if GPO is in there saying, hey, you're not allowed to run this, this just removes that restriction. And here's another example that I was putting together the other day. And this shows my execution policy is set as restricted. I try to run the file, and you see it can't be loaded because it's disabled. But now there's 2 ways to run it. You just read the file, pipe it to PowerShell.exe with no profile, and it executes. Or you can just read it and pass it to invoke expression, which will then parse out and execute everything within that file. And the execution policy is still restricted. We never changed it. So the moral of the story here is never, ever, 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 ever rely on the execution policy as a security control. Another attack that is really fun to play with, and I highly recommend messing around with this, it's called Invoke obfuscation. And it's a variety of different techniques that you can use to obfuscate your PowerShell, potentially bypass different types of alerting, make it harder for people to hunt through to see what you did. It lets you create a PowerShell script that runs without using PowerShell. It encodes and compresses your script. It base64 encodes it. It gives you a lot of different options to launch that script and try to evade detection. And just a little tip, if you ever want to detect if someone was trying to do something like this, there's a DLL, we'll talk about it later, system.management.automation.dll. That is really PowerShell. If you see that being loaded by a process, odds are it is doing some type of automation that can involve PowerShell. And we talked about here the downgrade attack. If you just add -v2, if you just change the version of the script, you're going to downgrade that all the protections available just by adding -v2. And if you're at a large company, if you're at a company that started off with Windows 7 and they went through an upgrade to Windows 10, PowerShell version 2 is still going to be enabled. It does not get disabled by default unless you're on one of the later builds of Windows 10 fresh. So I talked about this before, about how do you get PowerShell without even using PowerShell? So one answer is to use C#. You're able to use a PowerShell run space within C# and execute all of these PowerShell commands without being caught. And there's several tools out there that do this, because all you need to do is just reference that DLL that we talked about. So 2 examples, one of them is called Unmanaged Powershell. You could find it on GitHub. It starts .NET, loads a custom assembly that executes PowerShell, and even allows you to inject that into any running process. And if you don't have the right runtime, it loads the .NET 2.0 runtime. And that's important because, as we talked about here, V2 is .NET version 2. And that is missing a lot of those logging and monitoring controls. So this actually loads that runtime and makes sure that the logging controls that the enterprise wants doesn't really work. Okay, so I do see a question. The group policy be set to prevent downgrades. You would need to use group policy to actually remove PowerShell 2.0. And it is now a feature. It used to be something where you had to uninstall. Now on the later versions of Windows 10, it's just a Windows feature you could turn on and off easily with GPO, but you have to make sure you do apply it across the board. Good question. And if you have any other questions, definitely feel free, pipe them in. I'll make sure to bring them up. So what do we do now? We're terrified. We know the attackers have our entire network at their fingertips. We can't do anything about PowerShell. What do? The answer is a little bit of PowerShell. Just the obligatory disclaimer. Signatures are good, signatures are nice, signatures are for the lowest hanging fruit that fell off the tree. It's really not the best at detecting the behavior that an attacker will go through. So make sure that when you build those signatures, it's just part of your process and part of your approach. I've seen a lot of cases when I was consulting and going through for certain incidents and seeing, well, we had the signature and we were trying to detect it and we shouldn't be compromised and this is not fair. And then we look and all they did was put in a detection the entire command string with parameters. And as we talked about, an attacker doesn't have to do -v2, they could do -ve2, and suddenly that breaks the signature. So keep that disclaimer in mind. Well, we'll talk a little bit about what the detections are and what we can put in place to really help detect and help prevent these issues. The first thing is look at your network. Make sure you're getting some type of network telemetry. And if you're seeing a lot of high entropy byte strings, a lot of randomness there, you want to see, like, there could be a lot of encryption traffic going on. A lot of times the way PowerShell, especially the lazy ransomware works, is it's trying to encrypt remotely. You'll see something on the network. So you want to do some type of analysis and see, hey, are we connecting to hosts that we normally don't do? Do we normally see PowerShell trying to actually create network connections? On most people's systems, you're not usually supposed to see that. And then look at the endpoint. Are you expecting to see invoke expression or encoded command? Are you expecting to see that on your CFO's machine? Probably not. Is the bits activity normal? BITS stands for the Background Intelligent Transfer Service. It's a way that Microsoft lets you transfer large files quickly. But should you be seeing it computer to computer as often as you may see in your logs? And then really look, and this is the one that I think is one of the most important, system.management.automation.dll. Do you really see that normally being loaded into processes, being spawned by something that's not PowerShell? You might have some custom tools your dev team has built. Make sure those are signed. But you really shouldn't be seeing these assemblies loaded into odd processes. So how do we not panic? What do we need to do to actually breathe, know that what we're doing is detecting the attacker activity? And we'll go into all of these in a bit, but at the end of the day, a lot of this does rely on logging and monitoring, making sure you know what you're looking for and you can weed out the noise. And then a few preventive controls, such as just enough administration, which is one of my favorites that we're working on implementing right now. So the first we'll talk about is a system-wide transcript. And this works even if you're using PowerShell without PowerShell. So we talked about using C# or something else to run PowerShell commands. This will still work. And this can be easily configured through the GPO or the registry. And by default, all of your transcripts are going to be saved in My Documents. So when you configure this via GPO, you really kind of want to make sure that you create a separate mounted drive that it's write-only where you can store those transcripts, because they'll grow in size and you really don't want someone's computer to crash because of that. And I would highly recommend do not enable this on a domain controller. It will break the Active Directory GUI. I have no idea why, but I've yet to have that work. So I see a question about, is this using just the Windows security log? So yes, so this basically what this does in general with PowerShell, you'll be using the Windows log to find everything. In this specific case though, these transcripts don't use the log, they actually output everything to a text file. And I'll have this deck available to share as well, which will include in the notes some of the actual GPO locations where you can enable this. So this case, I actually like these transcripts because it's decoupled from the event log. So you can actually write this to a separate folder immediately that's write protected. And then one of the important ones here is script block logging. And this provides module logging, script blocks, deobfuscation, suspicious script detection. And the deobfuscation is the most important. What really, really makes it difficult when you're investigating an incident is understanding what scripts the attackers ran. By default, the Windows event log, they have a character limit. So a lot of times long scripts used to just get cut off after 255 characters, or you'll see a bunch of nonsense. When you have script block logging turn on, you'll be able to see the full script that gets executed. And if it was obfuscated, Microsoft deobfuscates it and basically shows you the script that it actually ran. It's extremely important. And it starts with in the verbose logs 4104. So we talked about that Windows event log. You'll be able to see that. You'll have to do some fun correlation there. So you'll see the script block log invocation start and stop, 4105, 4106. Everything in between there is typically going to be part of that script. It also checks for suspicious keywords. So automatically invoke expression or IEX, any of those types of keywords are going to get caught and flagged. This won't stop anything, but this will at least tell you if something needs to be looked at. And then we have the module logging. So this records all of the pipeline execution details, but it records a portion of scripts, deobfuscates some of the code, Not really reliable if you want everything, but it's been available since PowerShell 3. So if you're not yet on PowerShell 5, if you can't turn on script lock logging, at least make sure the module logging is on, and use a wildcard so you record all possible modules. Every single event gets written to one event ID. So if you are hunting, if you are looking for something, that's the event ID you should be going for. And again, this can be set via GPO or the registry. And then I didn't have room to put it here, but I did do a little bit of a test on what happens if you run Katz. And that generates over 2,000 events, because the module logging includes variable initialization, command invocations, everything. So it's going to take a lot of tweaking, but it's really good to have for forensics just in case. Then we have something called AMSI, which is Microsoft's anti-malware scan interface. And that allows any registered antivirus provider, if you're not using Windows Defender, to also access it. And what AMSI does is it lets you access the contents of every PowerShell script before it gets executed. There is no detection mechanisms. They don't try to see, hey, it's weird you're injecting into this process, but it gives you the contents of the script, and it relies on your AV signature-based detection. There's been a couple of bypasses. Microsoft then fixes them. Right now, I'm not aware of any bypasses for this, but it's important to keep in mind that this just evaluates, and I highly recommend going to your antivirus provider and actually asking them, do you hook into AMSI and what do you do? Because I have had the unfortunate surprise of talking to my AV provider at one company and finding out that they relied on their proprietary machine learning AI solution and didn't use AMSI. And then that script that I showed you way earlier in this presentation worked perfectly because they weren't able to see it. So it's always worth asking. And I do see a question here about the evil PowerShell frameworks and what I'd recommend to test to see if the logging works. I would honestly say Powersploit is one of my favorites that I use to test, but Invoke Katz is probably going to be one of the easiest ones. You may want to disable your AV while you're doing the test and obviously doing it on an isolated system, but that will generate a whole lot of noise and it'll let you run it a few different ways so you can actually test what logs are being created, what do they look like, and then build some of your rules and correlations that way. But a really good question. And then for organizations that don't really use PowerShell often, you want to look at something called the constrained language mode. It's not a panacea. It's a kind of an interim step, but it lets you limit the allowed types of cmdlets. So for example, that script I ran earlier would not work because I wouldn't be allowed to create a COM object. I wouldn't be allowed to add an assembly. I wouldn't be able to connect to the Windows 32 APIs. It works with AppLocker, but if anyone who may have touched AppLocker in the past, it's not very user-friendly. It's very finicky. So it's great for small organizations that don't really use it, or even a large organization where you know people really shouldn't be using PowerShell. And it can, unfortunately, be bypassed by a determined attacker. I've actually not seen any threat actors trying to run these in the malware that I've seen, but if you had a human-operated attack, they just need to remove an environment variable and they've gotten rid of constrained language mode. Good idea, kind of shoddy implementation by Microsoft. And then the next is kind of somewhat tangential, but it's protected event logging. And one of the problems you'll notice, if you're really logging everything, you're going to end up with credentials, you're going to end up with sensitive data in those logs. Whether an attacker ends up being able to view those logs because they're on the system directly, or you're putting it into your SIM, you want to turn on something called protected event logging. That will actually encrypt sensitive data when it's written to the log, and you can decrypt it once it's moved to a more secure location. It only exists in Windows 10. It's supported by PowerShell, but you have to have PowerShell version 5 and a specific KB installed. And you could just enable it through GPO, but again, I highly recommend if you're able to enable this. All right, and then I have a question here about, have we seen or currently use a SIM to capture these logs and check them? So I'm in the process right now of doing that. We've been doing some testing to find the right event logs that work in the right volume. But yes, I have used this in the past where we've sent this to a SIM. You could send this to pretty much anything because they are mostly Windows event logs, and then use those to kind of search through and do some correlations. For instance, any user that wasn't in IT and we started seeing activity from PowerShell, that was an immediate red flag for us. So we had to build a lot of these use cases ourselves. I haven't seen many SIMs that have out of the box give us all the PowerShell logs and we know what to do with them. So you'll have to think of those use cases on your own, but most SIMs should be able to import those logs pretty easily. The only exception are going to be those transcripts. And to be honest, putting those into something like Elk or Splunk, or something that just lets you search through that text, will help, because those are going to be mostly used for forensics. And then another area that I would recommend you look at is Winrm. So it's the Windows remoting. You want to limit that scope only to administration networks if you have them, or disable it where it's not necessary, because PowerShell will a lot of the times use Winrm to remote and move through the environment. You're not going to see the type of activity you normally see for RDP or even just SMB connections. So you want to really monitor usage for Winrm logs and network activity. And if you see that, you may have an issue. So the next item I want to spend some time on is something called Just Enough Administration, or JEA. And it's essentially role-based access control using PowerShell. So one of the biggest challenges in most organizations I've been to is the people in the domain admins group. You have a lot of people in there, but they don't necessarily need to be. And when I've asked, why do you got 20 people here? The answers are sometimes, well, he has to manage the DNS, and in order to manage DNS, you have to be an admin on a domain controller. And this person needs to join systems to the domain, so he has to have these permissions. And instead of giving them just exactly what they need to do their jobs, they're given a blanket domain admin role. So Just Enough Administration actually lets you create roles that lets non-administrators perform very specific administrative tasks. So I can let someone manage the Active Directory DNS service, but he's not going to have the ability to remove machines or people from the domain. This is something I would highly recommend working with your teams on. It's one of my favorite remediations. It takes some time to implement, but it's probably the best bang for your buck at reducing privileged access. Every single one of the endpoints that Just Enough Administration is on also has transcription and logging enabled, but it does require Windows 10. The earliest server it supports is 2016, and it requires PowerShell version 5. And again, this is going to be, to me, if there's one takeaway, this is one of the best approaches you can take to limit what someone can do maliciously with PowerShell. And let's talk a little bit about some of the interesting activity that you can see. So we talked about invoke expression. What you'll 9.9 times out of 10 see is when you see invoke expression, you're going to see system.net.web client activity. And that is the C# object that is used to download files, that's used to pretty much download a file into memory, run it in PowerShell, and now you have ransomware that's running in memory, not touching the disk itself. If you see encoded command and the word bypass, if you see any bits activity that you're not really expecting, you want to investigate that pretty quickly, because that could mean your data is leaving before the criminals are getting ready to actually trash the systems on the way out. If you actually see any manipulation of scheduled tasks, this is actually an interesting tactic I've observed from a couple threat actors, where rather than creating a new scheduled task, most users have Google Chrome on their system. Google Chrome typically creates a scheduled task to manage their updater. Well, no one really looks at that. Everyone's used to seeing that. So what happens if an attacker just modifies that, lets the update work, but then just tacks on a few extra commands? Very few people take a look at that. you'll want to look for any activity for Winrm, which is PowerShell remoting. And if you want to look at the AMSI results, the anti-malware scan interface, these two PowerShell commands can be run, and it'll show you by the initial detection time or the last time the threat status changed, any threats that it saw on the machine. And then lastly, please, no more local administrators, just stop doing it. The default local admin, protect it using Microsoft Laps, but that's it. And don't interactively remote into systems. It's very common, I've seen, for a lot of system administration activities. It's sometimes easier. Remote desktop, go into someone's system and do what you need to do. The problem with that is it not only creates a profile on their system for your account, your credentials are getting cached. And even though we've seen every talk at Black Hat for the last probably 10 years or so that mentioned to restrict cached logon credentials, I've yet to really see a company that has restricted the cached logon credentials to 1 or 0. And that means every time you're interactively logging on, they're caching credentials. So again, please don't use your admin account for that. And then get some usage statistics. Try to audit all script execution that happens in your environment, because odds are outside of IT and outside of known scripts, such as your logon scripts, your vulnerability scanning scripts, you shouldn't be seeing too much. And then do a trend analysis. If I ran PowerShell on 40 computers today, but until today, I've only ever run it on one, might want to report on that. And you don't have to pay money for this type of activity. If you, for instance, use SCCM, their software metering can report on it. Track the PowerShell remoting usage and trends. There are going to be times where system administrators will use PowerShell remoting, but make sure that's part of their normal playbook. And if it is, what are the trends and how is it typically used? So let's pivot and talk a little bit about some of the event IDs that you'll see. And just note, this is not everything, but you'll see a few here that I highly recommend taking a look at and making sure your SIM is capturing these. For instance, in an 800 pipeline execution detail, check that host application field because it shows what executed. If you see a version mismatch between the host version and the engine version, something is going to be a little finicky. And the host application should almost always be a standard Microsoft service. 4688 is one of the best ones that you can use to see if PowerShell is being launched from something else, because what it does is it shows you what process launches other processes from the command line. And again, to get some of these, you have to be on PowerShell version 5. Please make sure you do that. One note over here for event ID 500, the command lifecycle. If an attacker just does no profile as a parameter, nothing is going to appear here. So it's a nice to have, but definitely you're not going to see much. But when you correlate it in your SIM and you see, hey, I see PowerShell executed, but then I see no event 500, I see nothing. That's typically an indicator that someone ran PowerShell without a profile and you need to take a look. And some additional tips to talk about is require digitally signed macros. I know it's very hard to do this. I've been working in the financial industry for pretty much my entire career and trying to convince people that financial analysts or quants need to digitally sign all their macros or make sure that the macros they get from vendors are signed. It's tough. But disable macros then and only allow specific groups to use them. What we've started doing pretty successfully is they know there's this very specific folder on their computer where they're allowed to run macros, and that's it. If the macro runs directly from Outlook, if it runs from the downloads folder from anywhere else, it doesn't run. So you want to really take a look at that and make sure that you're limiting macros where you can. Allow lists by role and then baseline usage. An IT administrator's usage of PowerShell is going to be very different from the CFO's. So let's talk a little bit. Case study is a strong word here, but I wanted to sound fancy. Let's talk about just a report that FireEye put out some time back about kind of a ransomware attack called Headfake. And in the flow here, we see that the attackers redirected a user to one of those fake updates. Your Adobe's out of date, your browser's out of date. The Dridex malware was installed, and on execution, it used PowerShell, Empire, and Kodiak to move laterally throughout the network to perform reconnaissance, to learn about what else was there, gather information, and then move throughout the environment. So what do we actually learn from that? Is they're using PS remoting, they're using RDP, they're using a PowerShell framework as a C2. What could we have looked for? Well, here's some interesting event logs that I would highly recommend seeing. So event ID 600, you see the PowerShell logs. The host application was PowerShell.exe, and it was setting to disable monitoring. The next command was to uninstall Defender. And then we see when we correlate it with event ID 1034, that Windows successfully removed it. So it's always important that you make sure that you have these event IDs in place, that you're understanding what they can show and test it out. Someone asked the question earlier about using these types of evil PowerShell to test logging, and that's a really great idea. There's actually a project, an open source project called Atomic Red Team. I'd highly recommend taking a look at it. They use these atomic, very narrow focused tests that you could run in PowerShell. And the goal is to see, all right, did my EDR detect it? Did my AV detect it? Do the logs show me anything interesting? Because each of these types of cases can trigger different logs, but you'll start seeing a pattern. If you start seeing, for example, disable real-time monitoring, that's actually a useful signature because you should almost never see that in an event log. So just a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll have some time for some questions. But what's really important here is make sure you're using PowerShell version 5 and remove all other versions. You do not need to have PowerShell 2.0 in your environment. There is no need whatsoever. And just like all Microsoft products, security is not enabled out of the box. It would be great if the GPO settings for PowerShell logging were turned on, if it was just another event log folder. Unfortunately, it's not. So there's a lot of GPOs you're going to have to go through to turn on. There's going to be some trial and error, but it's worth it. Make sure you layer your defenses. We talked a little bit about kind of going through looking at your network logs, your endpoint logs. You're going to have to correlate between all of them to find that badness. If you have PowerShell that runs and starts trying to encrypt files throughout the network that communicates with a C2 server, you're going to need to detect that. There's been some tactics I've seen where attackers would use DNS text records as a way to communicate with C2 servers, where they would use social media to communicate. But if you can use PowerShell to see what is happening or what processes it's spawning, it's really helpful. And remember that PowerShell.exe is not the same as just PowerShell. You can have unsharper, you can have sharp pick. There's tons of different ways to execute PowerShell. So make sure you look a little broader than just PowerShell.exe. And remember that allow listing and baselining is your friend. Baseline the usage of PowerShell in your environment. Understand who uses it, how they use it, why they use it. And then if you can, start looking at allow listings, make sure certain users can use it, others who may not need to shouldn't use it. There's the Windows Defender application control feature, which just came out in the last couple of years, I think. And it's kind of a hybrid of Credential Guard and App Locker. Take a look at using that and combining it with App Locker so that you can block the bad guys from using PowerShell, but making sure that your own scripts, your IT administrators are still able to function. And if you had to prioritize, absolute first thing you should do, absolute right now, please do this today, is disable PowerShell version 2. That's number one, the easiest thing you can do. You can do it through GPU. You could do it through a logon script the minute someone joins the domain or logs on. Next, turn on script block logging. Make sure you're logging all of the commands, that you're logging everything people do. And then turn on just enough administration. You don't need that many domain admins. You don't need that many people logging onto a system. Give them the permissions they need to do their job without causing friction. but if they were compromised, that they couldn't take down the network. And then later implement the rest of those controls that we talked about. So here are some references. And again, I will have this available. Just ping me after, I'll be able to send this over. There's, as you could see, a lot of fun red team tools out there. There's a few blue team tools as well as some purple team tools. I highly recommend taking a look at these. They'll help you get an idea of how the attackers function. A lot of these tools are not necessarily evil, but they have the potential for evil. It's how you use it. So play around in your environment and see what gets picked up, what doesn't. Make sure if you are doing testing on your work systems, make sure the security team actually knows about it so they don't go all crazy if they see anything. But take a look and see what you can do. The logging cheat sheet over here is going to be one of your favorite resources. I still refer to it a lot. It shows you some of the event IDs that are valuable and the GPO settings to enable them. And with that, any questions? All right. Well, at that point, I'll still be here. Thank you so much for your time.